Richard Sterling had always believed that success was measured by the weight of one's wallet and the height of one's tower. At 42, he stood at the pinnacle of Manhattan's financial district, both literally and figuratively. His corner office on the 68th floor of the Sterling Financial Building offered a commanding view of the city that had made him one of the youngest billionaires in America. But on this particular Tuesday morning in October 2023, Richard felt nothing but the cold emptiness that had been growing inside him for months. The irony wasn't lost on him that his name adorned the building where he spent 16 hours a day, orchestrating deals that moved millions of dollars with the click of a mouse. Richard Sterling, a name that once meant something to his father, a humble accountant who had worked 3 jobs to put Richard through Harvard Business School. Now, that same name was whispered in boardrooms across Wall Street, sometimes with admiration, often with fear, and increasingly with disdain. Richard's rise to the top had been meteoric but ruthless. He had built his empire by acquiring struggling companies, stripping them of their assets, and selling the pieces to the highest bidder. Thousands of employees had lost their jobs in the process, but Richard had learned to view them as numbers on a spreadsheet rather than human beings with families, dreams, and bills to pay. It was easier that way. Emotion, he had discovered, was the enemy of profit. His personal life reflected the same cold efficiency. His marriage to Victoria, a former model turned socialite, had ended in a bitter divorce 3 years earlier. She had taken half of his assets and, more painfully, full custody of their 8-year-old daughter, Emma. "You chose money over family," Victoria had said during their final court appearance. "Don't expect Emma to make the same mistake when she's old enough to choose between us." Those words had haunted Richard more than he cared to admit. His relationship with Emma had become a series of scheduled visits, expensive gifts, and awkward conversations. She was polite but distant, treating him more like a distant uncle than a father. Last month, when he had missed her school play because of an emergency board meeting, she had simply nodded and said, "I understand, Daddy. Work is more important." The resignation in her voice had cut deeper than any angry outburst could have. On this particular morning, Richard was preparing for what his team called the Avalanche, a coordinated takeover of 6 small family businesses across the Midwest. The companies were struggling but still profitable, employing nearly 2,000 people in small towns where they were often the primary source of income. Richard's plan would consolidate their operations, eliminate redundancias, and increase efficiency by 40%. It would also eliminate about 60% of the jobs. "Sir," his assistant, Jennifer, knocked on his office door. "The legal team is ready for the final review." Richard nodded without looking up from his computer screen. "Tell them I'll be there in 10 minutes. And Jennifer, make sure the PR team has their damage control strategy ready. The media will try to paint us as the villains again." "Already handled, sir. They've prepared statements emphasizing job creation in our consolidated facilities." "Good. What about the families affected by the closures?" Jennifer hesitated. "Sir, you said you didn't want to discuss individual impact assessments." Richard finally looked up, seeing something in Jennifer's expression that he couldn't quite identify. "Right, of course. Just the numbers matter." As Jennifer left, Richard returned to his screen, but found himself unable to focus on the financial projections. Instead, he found himself thinking about his father, who had died 5 years earlier. Robert Sterling had been a man who knew every one of his clients by name, who had worked for 30 years at the same small accounting firm, and who had never earned more than $60,000 in a single year. Yet he had been respected, loved, and had died surrounded by friends and family who genuinely mourned his passing. Richard shook his head, dismissing the unwelcome thoughts. Sentiment was a luxury he couldn't afford, especially not today. He grabbed his Italian leather briefcase, checked his Rolex, and headed toward the conference room where his team was waiting to finalize the destruction of 6 family legacies. The meeting lasted for hours. Charts and graphs filled the rooms, massive screens showing projected profits, market consolidation opportunities, and efficiency improvements. Not once did anyone mention the names of the families who had built these businesses over generations, or the communities that would be devastated when the primary employers disappeared. "Excellent work, everyone," Richard said as the meeting concluded. "Legal will file the paperwork tomorrow morning. I want this wrapped up before the weekend." As his team filed out, discussing lunch plans and weekend getaways, Richard remained in the conference room, staring at the final slide of their presentation. It showed a single number, $847 million in projected profits over the next 3 years. Below it, in smaller font, was another number, 1,247 jobs eliminated. His phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "Daddy, I made the honor roll. Mom said I could call you tonight if you're not too busy." Richard stared at the message for a long moment. When was the last time he had told his daughter he was proud of her? When was the last time he had asked about her friends, her dreams, her fears? He started to type a response, then stopped. What could he say? Batty was proud but wouldn't be available to talk because he was celebrating the financial ruin of other families. Instead, he simply typed, "Congratulations, sweetheart. I'll try to call later." The afternoon passed in a blur of phone calls with investors, strategy sessions with department heads, and reviews of quarterly projections. By 7 o'clock, the office had emptied except for Richard and the cleaning crew. He finally decided to head home to his penthouse apartment, though home felt like an overstatement for the sterile, professionally decorated space that had never heard a child's laughter or hosted a family dinner. As he walked through the lobby of his building, Richard nodded to the security guard, a man named Frank, who had worked there for 15 years. Frank always smiled and wished him a good evening, though Richard had never bothered to learn anything about the man's life beyond his function as a security presence. "Good evening, Mr. Sterling," Frank said warmly. "Hope you have a pleasant night." "Thank you, Frank," Richard replied, though he was already thinking about the emails he needed to send before bed. The October air was crisp as Richard stepped onto the sidewalk. Manhattan was alive with its usual evening energy. People heading home from work, tourists taking photos, street vendors calling out their wares. Richard walked the 6 blocks to his apartment building, a route he had taken thousands of times but had never really observed. Tonight, however, something made him pause. Perhaps it was the weight of the day's decisions, or the text from Emma, or simply the exhaustion that came from years of emotional numbness. Whatever the reason, Richard found himself actually seeing the city around him. For the first time in years, he noticed the homeless man who sat outside the coffee shop on 5th Avenue, the same spot where Richard bought his morning espresso. The man was probably in his 50s, with weathered hands and kind eyes that seemed to hold stories Richard had never bothered to wonder about. Their eyes met for a moment, and the homeless man nodded politely. Richard looked away quickly, uncomfortable. With the brief human connection a few blocks later, he passed a small family restaurant where he could see through the windows to families sharing meals. Children laughing, parents listening intently to their kids' stories about school. The warmth and genuine connection he witnessed made his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't quite name. By the time Richard reached his building, he felt more unsettled than he had in years. The doorman greeted him with professional courtesy, and Richard rode the elevator to his penthouse in silence. His apartment was exactly as he had left it, immaculate, expensive, and utterly devoid of life. He poured himself a glass of 25-year-old scotch and stood at his floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, Emma was probably doing homework or getting ready for bed. Somewhere out there, 1,247 families were going about their evening routines, unaware that their lives were about to be upended by decisions made in a conference room they would never see. Richard pulled out his phone to call Emma, but hesitated. What kind of father was he? What kind of man had he become? The questions felt dangerous, threatening to crack the carefully constructed walls he had built around his emotions. Instead of calling his daughter, Richard finished his scotch and went to bed, telling himself that tomorrow would bring new opportunities, new deals, new victories. He had no way of knowing that tomorrow would also bring an encounter that would force him to confront everything he had become and everything he had lost in his relentless pursuit of success. As he fell asleep in his king-sized bed, surrounded by luxury but utterly alone, Richard Sterling was still the man who valued profit over people, efficiency over empathy. But change, like the homeless man he had briefly noticed on 5th Avenue, was waiting patiently for the right moment to step into his carefully ordered world and turn everything upside down. Richard woke at 5:30 a.m., as he had every day for the past 15 years. His morning routine was as precise as his business strategies. 30 minutes on the treadmill, 15 minutes reviewing overnight market reports from Asia, shower, dress in one of his 12 identical navy suits, and out the door by 6:45 for his morning espresso at Cafe Luna on 5th Avenue. The routine was comforting in its predictability. Richard had learned long ago that success came from eliminating variables, controlling outcomes, and never leaving anything to chance. Spontaneity was the enemy of efficiency, and efficiency was the foundation of wealth. As he walked toward Cafe Luna, Richard's mind was already focused on the day ahead. The legal paperwork for the Avalanche would be filed this morning, and he expected the first wave of media coverage by noon. His PR team had prepared statements, his legal team had anticipated challenges, and his financial team had projected every possible market reaction. Everything was under control. The homeless man was in his usual spot outside the cafe, sitting on a piece of cardboard with a small cup for donations. Richard had seen him there every morning for months, maybe years, but had never really looked at him. Today, however, something made Richard pause. The man was reading a book, a thick, worn paperback that looked like it had been read many times. His clothes were clean, but obviously old and patched in several places. Despite his circumstances, there was a dignity about him that Richard found unexpectedly compelling. The man looked up and smiled. "Good morning," the homeless man said. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" Richard was caught off guard by the genuine warmth in the man's voice. "Yes, I suppose it is. I'm Marcus," the man said, extending a weathered hand. "I see you here every morning. Thought it was time we properly met." Richard hesitated, then shook Marcus's hand. "Richard, pleasure to meet you." "Richard, you look like a man with a lot on his mind." "I suppose I do." Richard wasn't sure why he was engaging in conversation. This wasn't part of his routine. Mind if I ask what you do for work? I'm in finance. Mergers and acquisitions. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. Ah, you help companies grow and change. That must be rewarding. Richard almost laughed at the innocent interpretation. Something like that. Well, I hope you have a good day, Richard. And remember, every day is a chance to make a difference in someone's life. Richard nodded awkwardly and went into the cafe, ordering his usual double espresso. As he waited, he found himself glancing back at Marcus through the window. The homeless man had returned to his book, but there was something about his peaceful demeanor that stayed with Richard as he walked to his office. The morning proceeded exactly as planned. The legal filings were submitted, the first news reports appeared online, and Richard's phone began ringing with calls from investors and journalists. By lunch, the Avalanche was trending on financial news websites, with the usual mix of praise from shareholders and criticism from labor advocates. Richard was in his element, fielding calls and managing the narrative. This was what he did best: information, managing perceptions, and turning controversy into profit. By 2 p.m., his company's stock had risen 3% on news of the acquisitions. Sir, Jennifer knocked on his door. Channel 7 wants a statement about the job losses. Should I refer them to PR? No, I'll handle it myself. Schedule a call for 3 p.m. Richard spent the next hour preparing for the interview, reviewing talking points about market efficiency, competitive necessity, and long-term economic benefits. He had given similar interviews dozens of times and could deliver the corporate messaging in his sleep. The interview went smoothly. Richard explained how the consolidations would create a stronger, more competitive company that would ultimately benefit consumers and shareholders. When the reporter asked about the families losing their jobs, Richard delivered his prepared response about severance packages and job placement assistance. But Mr. Sterling, the reporter pressed, these are small towns where your companies are often the primary employers. What happens to communities when their economic foundation disappears? Markets evolve, Richard replied smoothly. Companies that adapt survive and thrive. Those that don't make room for more efficient operations? It's basic economics, and the human cost. Change is never easy, but it's necessary for progress. After the interview, Richard felt the familiar satisfaction that came from a well-executed performance. He had stayed on message, avoided emotional appeals, and reinforced his company's position as a leader in market efficiency. The rest of the afternoon was filled with strategy meetings and conference calls. By 7 p.m., Richard was ready to head home, satisfied with a productive day. The Avalanche was proceeding exactly as planned, and early market reactions were positive. As he walked through the lobby, Frank, the security guard, smiled and waved. Have a good evening, Mr. Sterling. Hope tomorrow's even better. Thank you, Frank, Richard replied, though he was already thinking about dinner and the evening reports he needed to review. The walk home took him past Caf Luna again. Marcus was still there, though he had put away his book and was talking quietly with an elderly woman who had stopped to chat. Richard could hear fragments of their conversation, something about her grandson's upcoming graduation, and Marcus offering encouragement about the young man's job prospects. Richard found himself slowing down, intrigued by the genuine care in Marcus's voice as he listened to the woman's concerns. When had Richard last had a conversation like that? When had he last listened to someone without calculating how the information might benefit him? As he continued walking, Richard's phone buzzed with a text from Emma. Daddy, I tried calling earlier, but it went to voicemail. Mom says you're probably busy with work. I just wanted to tell you about my science project. We're studying ecosystems and how everything is connected. It's really cool. Richard stopped walking and read the message again. Emma had called, and he had been so focused on managing the media response to the avalanche that he hadn't even noticed. His daughter had wanted to share something she was excited about, and he had missed it completely. He started to call her back, then realized it was past her bedtime. Another missed opportunity. Another small failure in the long list of ways he had prioritized business over family. Richard's apartment felt even more sterile than usual that evening. He ordered dinner from his usual restaurant, reviewed market reports, and prepared for the next day's meetings. But he found himself distracted, thinking about Marcus's words. Every day is a chance to make a difference in someone's life. What kind of difference was Richard making? His company's stock price was higher, his investors were happy, and his personal wealth had increased by several $1 million in a single day. But 1,247 families were about to lose their primary source of income, and his own daughter had to compete with board meetings for her father's attention. Richard tried to push these thoughts away. Sentiment was counterproductive. Emotion clouded judgment. Success required focus, determination, and the ability to make difficult decisions without being paralyzed by their human consequences. But as he lay in bed that night, Richard found sleep elusive. He kept thinking about the contrast between Marcus's genuine warmth toward a stranger and his own calculated responses to everyone in his life. When had he become someone who measured every interaction in terms of potential benefit? When had he stopped seeing people as individuals and started seeing them only as variables in his equations for success? The next morning, Richard's routine began as usual, but as he approached Cafe Luna, he found himself looking forward to seeing Marcus again. There was something about the homeless man's perspective that intrigued him, though he couldn't quite articulate why. Marcus was in his usual spot, reading the same worn paperback. He looked up as Richard approached and smiled. "Good morning, Richard. How did your day go yesterday?" "It was productive," Richard replied. "What are you reading?" Marcus held up the book. "It's called Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. Have you read it?" Richard shook his head. "I don't have much time for reading outside of business journals. It's about finding purpose and meaning, even in the most difficult circumstances." Frankl was a Holocaust survivor who became a psychiatrist. He wrote about how people can endure almost anything if they have a sense of purpose. "Interesting," Richard said, though he wasn't sure why Marcus thought he needed to hear about finding meaning. "He has this quote that always stays with me. Everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of human freedoms to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances." Richard nodded politely and went into the cafe, but Marcus's words followed him. As he waited for his espresso, he found himself wondering what his own sense of purpose was. Making money? Building an empire? Winning at all costs? The day proceeded, with more interviews, more strategy sessions, and more confirmation that the Avalanche was succeeding exactly as planned. But Richard found himself increasingly distracted by questions he had never bothered to ask himself. That evening, as he walked home, Richard made an impulsive decision. Instead of his usual route, he took a detour through Central Park. The October evening was beautiful, with families enjoying the playground, couples walking hand in hand, and children feeding ducks at the pond. Richard sat on a bench and watched the scene around him. Everyone seemed to be enjoying simple pleasures time with loved ones. Fresh air, the beauty of autumn leaves. When was the last time he had done something simply because it brought him joy? His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Jennifer, with an urgent question about tomorrow's board meeting. As Richard handled the call, he realized that even his attempt at spontaneity had been interrupted by work, but something had shifted. For the first time in years, Richard found himself questioning not just his schedule, but his entire approach to life. The encounter with Marcus had planted a seed of doubt about whether success measured only in dollars was really success at all. He had no way of knowing that tomorrow would bring an event that would force him to confront these questions in a way that would change everything. But Friday morning arrived with a kind of crisp autumn clarity that made Manhattan look like a postcard. Richard followed his usual routine, but found himself anticipating his brief conversation with Marcus more than his morning espresso. Over the past 3 days, their exchanges had become the most genuine human interactions in Richard's carefully controlled world. As he approached Cafe Luna, however, Richard noticed that Marcus's usual spot was empty. The piece of cardboard was there, weighed down by a small stone, but Marcus was nowhere to be seen. Richard felt an unexpected pang of disappointment. He had been looking forward to asking Marcus about the book he was reading, perhaps even continuing their conversation about purpose and meaning. Richard ordered his espresso and lingered outside the cafe longer than usual, hoping Marcus might appear. When he didn't, Richard reluctantly headed to his office, telling himself it was ridiculous to be concerned about a homeless man's whereabouts. The day was packed with meetings related to the Avalanche. The acquisitions were proceeding smoothly, and Richard's team was already identifying additional targets for the next quarter. By lunch, Richard had approved the closure of 3 of the 6 acquired facilities, effective immediately. The affected employees would be notified by email at 5 p.m. "Sir." Jennifer knocked on his door around 2 p.m. "There's a situation developing in Ohio. Local news crews are at the Hartwell manufacturing plant. Apparently, some employees heard rumors about the closure and are staging a protest." Richard pulled up the live news feed on his computer. The scene showed about 50 workers holding signs reading "Save our jobs and families before profits." The reporter was interviewing a middle-aged woman who was crying as she spoke about working at the plant for 22 years and not knowing how she would support her disabled son. "Get PR on this immediately," Richard instructed. "Standard messaging about market forces and economic necessity, and have legal review our notification timeline. I want to make sure we're not exposed to any wrongful termination claims." "Yes, sir." Also, the board wants to move up Monday's meeting to discuss accelerating the timeline for the remaining closures. Richard nodded, already mentally preparing for the strategic discussions ahead. But as he watched the news coverage, he found himself focusing on the faces of the protesters rather than the potential legal implications. These weren't numbers on a spreadsheet, they were real people with families, mortgages, and dreams that were about to be shattered by his decisions. He shook his head, trying to refocus on the business implications. Emotion was counterproductive. These closures were necessary for long-term competitiveness. The market demanded efficiency, and efficiency sometimes required difficult choices. The afternoon was consumed by damage control. Richard gave 3 more interviews, emphasizing the company's commitment to helping displaced workers find new opportunities. He spoke about severance packages and job placement services, though he knew these offerings were minimal compared to the disruption the closures would cause. By 6 p.m., the notifications had been sent, and Richard's phone was buzzing with calls. From reporters seeking comment on the workers' reactions, he let them go to voicemail, deciding he had done enough media management for one day. As Richard prepared to leave the office, he realized he had forgotten to eat lunch. The stress of managing the crisis had consumed his entire day. He decided to grab dinner at a restaurant near his apartment rather than ordering in. The walk home took him past Cafe Luna again. Marcus's spot was still empty, though someone had left a small bouquet of flowers on the cardboard. Richard wondered if something had happened to the homeless man, and was surprised by how much the thought troubled him. Lost in thought about Marcus and the day's events, Richard didn't notice the uneven sidewalk ahead of him. His foot caught on a raised section of concrete, and he stumbled, his briefcase flying open and scattering papers across the sidewalk. As he bent to collect the documents, he felt his wallet slip from his jacket pocket. Richard gathered his papers quickly, anxious to get off the busy sidewalk where pedestrians were stepping around him with varying degrees of patience. He stuffed everything back into his briefcase and hurried toward the restaurant, his mind already moving to the evening's agenda. It wasn't until he reached the restaurant and the hostess asked for his credit card to hold his reservation that Richard realized his wallet was missing. He patted his pockets frantically, then retraced his steps mentally. The last time he remembered having it was at the office, but he could have dropped it anywhere during his walk. Richard spent the next hour retracing his route, searching the sidewalks and asking shopkeepers if anyone had turned in a lost wallet. The wallet contained not just his credit cards and cash, but also his driver's license, several important business cards, and the only photo he carried of Emma picture from her 6th birthday party, taken during happier times when his marriage was still intact. As darkness fell, Richard gave up his search and returned to his apartment. He spent the evening canceling credit cards and dreading the hassle of replacing his identification. But what bothered him most was losing the photo of Emma. It was the only picture he looked at regularly, a reminder of what he had sacrificed. In his pursuit of success, Saturday morning, Richard broke his routine for the first time in years. Instead of his usual workout and market review, he decided to make one more attempt to find his wallet. He walked his entire route from the previous evening, checking every trash can, every doorway, every place the wallet might have ended up. As he approached Cafe Luna, Richard saw that Marcus had returned to his usual spot. The homeless man was sitting on his cardboard, reading his book, looking exactly as he had every other morning. Richard felt a wave of relief that surprised him with its intensity. "Marcus," Richard called out as he approached. "I'm glad to see you're okay. I was worried when you weren't here yesterday." Marcus looked up with his characteristic warm smile. "That's very kind of you, Richard. I had to spend the day at the hospital with a friend who was having surgery. Nothing serious, but he needed someone there." "That was good of you," Richard said, meaning it. "Listen, I lost my wallet somewhere around here last night. You haven't seen anyone turn one in, have you?" Marcus's expression changed, becoming more serious. "Actually, yes, a wallet was found last night. The person who found it asked me to return it to you." Richard felt a surge of relief. "That's incredible. Do you have it?" "I do, but there's something I need to tell you first." Marcus reached into a small bag beside him and pulled out Richard's wallet, along with a folded piece of paper. "The person who found this asked me to give you this note along with your wallet." Richard took both items, immediately checking to make sure his credit cards and Emma's photo were still there. Everything was intact. "Who found it? I'd like to thank them. The note will explain everything," Marcus said gently. Richard unfolded the paper, expecting to find contact information or perhaps a request for a reward. Instead, he found a handwritten letter that made his hands tremble as he read. "Dear Mr. Sterling, I found your wallet last night after you dropped it on 5th Avenue. I know who you are. Your face has been all over the news this week. I also know what you do for a living because my husband worked for Hartwell Manufacturing for 18 years before yesterday. My name is Sarah Chen, and my husband David was one of the 247 people who lost their jobs when you closed the Hartwell plant. We have 2 children, ages 8 and 12, and a mortgage we can no longer afford. David is 52 years old and has worked in manufacturing his entire adult life. The job market for someone his age in our town is virtually non-existent. I could have kept your wallet. The cash inside would pay our grocery bill for 2 weeks. Your credit cards could have helped us make this month's mortgage payment, but I didn't take anything, and I'll tell you why. When I was going through your wallet to find identification so I could return it, I found the photo of your daughter. She looks about the same age as my youngest, and she has your eyes. In that photo, she's laughing, and you're looking at her like she's the most important thing in your world. I realized that despite everything you've done to my family, you're still someone's father. You're still a human being who loves his child and carries her picture in his wallet. I couldn't steal from someone who loves their daughter the way I love mine. But I want you to know what your decisions have cost us. David came home yesterday and cried for the first time since his father died. My 12-year-old asked me if we're going to lose our house, and I didn't know what to tell her. My 8-year-old drew a picture of our family and asked why. Daddy looks so sad. I don't expect this letter to change anything. I know you probably get hundreds of angry letters from people whose lives have been affected by your business decisions. But I wanted you to know that we're real people with real families. And your choices have real consequences. I also wanted you to know that despite everything, I still believe in treating people with dignity and respect. That's why I'm returning your wallet with everything intact. It's not because I think you deserve it, but because it's the right thing to do. I hope someday you'll understand the difference. Sarah Chum P.S. The homeless man I gave this to, Marcus, told me you've been talking with him this week. He said you seem like someone who's searching for something. I hope you find it before you lose everything that really matters. Richard read the letter 3 times, his hands shaking more with each reading. When he finally looked up, Marcus was watching him with compassionate eyes. She's a remarkable woman, Marcus said quietly. She could have been angry, vindictive, even cruel. Instead, she chose grace. Richard's voice was barely a whisper. I destroyed her family. Yes, Marcus said simply. You did, but you also have the power to help rebuild it. How? The decision's been made. The plant is closed. There are always choices, Richard. Always opportunities to do the right thing, even when it costs us something. Richard stared at the letter, seeing Sarah Chen's careful handwriting. Imagining her sitting at her kitchen table writing these words while her husband grieved and her children worried about their future. He thought about Emma's photo in his wallet, about the way Sarah had recognized a father's love even in the midst of her own family's crisis. What kind of man have I become? Richard asked, the question escaping before he could stop it. You've become someone who forgot that every number on a spreadsheet represents a human life, Marcus replied. But you're also someone who can choose to remember. Richard looked at Marcus, really looked at him for the first time. How do you know so much about choice and meaning? What's your story? Marcus smiled sadly. I used to be like you, Richard, not in finance, but in my own way. I was a surgeon, successful and respected. I was so focused on my career that I missed my son's childhood, ignored my wife's needs, and prioritized my reputation over my relationships. When my wife died in a car accident, I realized I had spent 20 years building a career and forgotten to build a life. Richard felt like the ground was shifting beneath his feet. What happened? I fell apart. Started drinking, lost my practice, lost my home, ended up here. Marcus gestured to his cardboard seat, but I also found something. I had lost my humanity. Out here, you learn that every person has a story. Every interaction matters, and every day is a chance to choose who you want to be. But you're homeless. You've lost everything. Have I? Marcus asked. I have friends who care about me, people who trust me with their stories, and the freedom to choose kindness over profit every single day. I may not have money, but I have something more valuable. I have peace. Richard looked down at Sarah Chen's letter again, then at the photo of Emma in his wallet. For the first time in years, he saw his life clearly. The wealth he had accumulated, the relationships he had destroyed, the man he had become in pursuit of success that felt increasingly hollow. Marcus, Richard said, his voice stronger now. If you could go back, would you do things differently? Every day, Marcus replied. But I can't go back. None of us can. We can only choose what to do with the time we have left. Richard stood up, decision crystallizing in his mind. I need to make some phone calls. What are you going to do? I'm going to try to remember what it means to be human. As Richard walked away, Marcus called after him. Richard, remember, it's never too late to choose differently. Richard spent the weekend making the most important phone calls of his career. By Monday morning, he had restructured the Hartwell deal to keep the plant open, personally absorbed the financial loss, and established a fund to help the families affected by the other closures. It cost him nearly $50 million and the respect of his board of directors. But when he called Emma that evening and heard the joy in her voice as she told him about her science project, Richard knew he had made the right choice. For the first time in years, he was becoming the kind of man his daughter could be proud of, the kind of man who understood that some things were more valuable than money. The note from Sarah Chen remained in his wallet next to Emma's photo, a daily reminder that every choice has consequences and every person deserves to be seen as more than a number on a spreadsheet. Legal disclaimer: this story is completely fictional and was created for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental.